acknowledge Mr. Quinn's hardness of heart and meanness of spirit. And I acknowledge Simon Bridges' comment that Muriu Ture's speech was a good speech. We know who has a political future. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's statement is simply a reiteration of government policy enunciated first in the speech from the throne 2 years ago and recycled every February and May. The government identifies as its principal goal building the foundations for a strong economy. That is the platform upon which our aspirations are said to rest. No mention of what those aspirations actually are. No mention here of a decent society, a far-sighted nation, or a globally responsible citizen. Just a strong economy. Thank you, Prime Minister, for your far-sighted statesmanship. And what is meant by a strong economy? Building a strong economy is based on, quote, enduring growth. The immediate task is to stabilise the economy and put it back on a growth path. Putting the economy back on a growth path is taking longer than anticipated. But that is good, because the Prime Minister has no clear insight into the relationship between a growth path to a strong economy and a level path to a sustainable economy. Can a sustainable economy be a strong economy? Of course it can, but not the way this Prime Minister sees it. The Prime Minister has no conception of the causal link between his plans for a growth economy today and a failed economy a few decades after his departure. He talks about the ETS, wanting to ensure that it is working as well as possible. The ETS, he believes, prepares New Zealand for a carbon-constrained future by providing business and consumers with the incentives and encouragement they need to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, the ETS does nothing of the sort. It is accurately described by Jeff Bertram and Simon Terry as a mechanism not for reducing emissions, but of transferring wealth as emissions increase. The ETS, they say, has not been designed to promote economically efficient abatement. It has been designed first to protect and promote the position of vested interests that are unwilling to shoulder the asset write-downs required to recognise a price on carbon, and second, to transfer the costs of this to future generations. While the original design of the ETS, they conclude, aimed to confront polluters with the full cost of the nation's obligations under the Kyoto Protocol, the scheme legislated for in 2008 went only halfway towards this, and the 2009 amendments all but abandoned the concept. The original concept, of course, was a carbon tax, but that founded on vested interests. So we all converted to a cap-and-trade system, except that here in God's own we forgot the cap. But we kept the trade, so that we can all succumb to the siren call of auctioning off free credits for next to nothing. The Kiwi brand of ETS is now a licence to pollute without restraint. It allows industry to pass on today's modest costs within this generation to households and small business, and allow all of us to pass on the much larger cost to our children. Are we too blind to see what is going on? The classic example of the insanity of what we are doing is Solid Energy and its government-backed plans to utilise lignite in Southland, the lowest grade of coal that's possible to mine. Solid Energy's plans include 4 projects for the extraction of lignite over the next decade. The projects are diesel plants, a urea plant, a briquette plant and an electricity plant. Each of these is certain to increase our national GHG emissions. In 2009, the government committed New Zealand to a 10 to 20% cut in emissions off the 1990 level. This is inadequate in light of the UN's prescription of 25 to 40% cuts by 2020. But let us at least address the weak target the government has adopted for itself. At present, with the ETS in place, our emissions are projected to be 30% above the 1990 level by 2020. That is a national shame. Yet that excess is calculated without the massive injection into the atmosphere that will come from Solid Energy's cheerful contribution to the betterment of humankind. The 2 lignite to diesel plants alone will increase that 30% emission overshoot by half as much again. That is to say, increase the 30% overshoot to a 45% overshoot. The other projects will make the total worse. How clever is that? What pride are we to take as a nation in that magnificent plan for low-carbon energy? At the pure cost, Mr. Speaker, of the planet. A country which, having been requested by the UN to cut emissions by some 30% by 2020, consciously plans to engage in fossil fuel extraction whose emissions will result in an overshoot of the 1990 level by 45%, is a country without shame. A country with no moral integrity. A country with no sense of global responsibility. But never mind who's looking. We can make some money extracting this atrocious material that will choke the life forms on this planet. And we can export some of it, so it will not appear on our national carbon account. And what is more, we hear the claim from Solid Energy, clearly an objective authority on the subject, that the plans for these projects will result in a reduction in GHG emissions. How to understand this breathtaking claim? How are we to credit Solid Energy with any credibility on this? And how are we to reconcile the increasing inconsistency in the various statements being put out by the hydra-headed creature that this government has become? The government has become victim to its own timidity in face of global climate change, national responsibility targets and local interest group pressure. Mr. Brownlee is Minister of Energy. Dr. Smith is Minister for Climate Change. You would think that as ministers in the same cabinet serving under the erstwhile Mr. Key, they would speak with one voice, or at least harmonious voices singing melodically from the same song sheet. So what do we hear? What faint melodic harmony do we discern in New Zealand's official thinking in early 2011? Dr. Smith says the following, quote, "It is ironic that while we try and design pricing instruments to recognise the environmental cost of emissions, the world spends hundreds of billions of dollars a year subsidising fossil fuels and pollution. If we are serious about addressing climate change in the most efficient way, we need to be discussing a phase-out of such support." Mr. Brownlee, who prefers energy security to climate responsibility, says the following, "The PCE report on the emissions increase to be caused by the lignite projects is a separate report. It has nothing to do with energy strategy." Well, Minister, I suggest you revise the draft energy strategy and make sure it does. And Prime Minister, I suggest you devote your considerable analytical skills to reconciling what your ministers are saying, because your government is approaching dysfunctionality in policy, where senior ministers are saying irreconcilable things, things that cannot be matched in logic. And after all, Prime Minister, yours is a logical and rational, if visionless, government. So, Mr. Speaker, when the Prime Minister says in his statement this afternoon that, quote, "This year's election will be about which party has a realistic plan to achieve faster economic growth for New Zealanders," we agree. Where we disagree is over his blithe assumption that raping the planet for a 19th century-style profit is a realistic plan. It is unrealistic to the point of criminal negligence. And this Prime Minister, whether he enjoys it or not, presides over a group of ministers who are meant to be saying the same thing. Let me say to the ministers and to Solid Energy, the amount of fossil fuel remaining on the planet is finite. If all the remaining fossil fuel is extracted and burnt, we shall massively exceed the planet's climate change boundary. Neither energy efficiency nor renewable energy will save us unless most of the fossil fuel, which would otherwise be mined, stays in the ground, stays there forever. It is implausible that any conventional oil will be left in the ground, but it is possible and necessary to phase out coal on a straight-line basis up to 2030. That is an unpalatable truth if you think coal is sexy, and dirty coal the sexiest of all. It remains a truth nonetheless, and this government better get over it. You simply cannot afford to be, in the 21st century, filthy rich. I say to the government and Solid Energy, every tonne of coal that stays in the ground in New Zealand forever is 2 tonnes of carbon that never reaches the atmosphere. You both have an obligation to ensure that the lignite never sees the light of today, lest tomorrow's daylight becomes clouded by a hot and stifling atmosphere. Mr. Speaker, it is time we came to our senses.